Imagine you are an engineer. You have spent years of your life working inside one of the most protected, most secretive facilities on the planet. Every morning you walk through layers of security, guards, gates, biometric checkpoints, underground corridors. You sit down at your workstation, put on your headphones, and stare at the monitoring screens in front of you. The numbers look normal. The readouts are clean. Every indicator says the machines are running exactly as they should. And then the machines start dying, one by one, then in clusters. The centrifuges, these tall, spinning cylinders of precision-engineered aluminum, begin tearing themselves apart from the inside. Not because of a power surge, not because of a mechanical fault anyone can find, not because of anything you did wrong. The equipment simply starts failing, and you cannot explain why, because every screen in front of you is telling you that everything is fine. You are standing in the middle of a sabotage so sophisticated, so invisible, so perfectly designed that you, the engineer responsible for this facility, are the very last person who would ever know it was happening. This is not a scene from a movie. This happened in real life, deep underground, beneath the Iranian desert, inside a facility called Natanz, and the weapon that did it was not a missile, not a bomb, not a commando team. It was a piece of code, a string of digital instructions so precisely engineered that it crossed a line that had never been crossed in all of human history. It became the first weapon ever built that could reach through the invisible world of software and cause real, physical, irreversible destruction in the real world. This is the story of Stuxnet. This is the story of Operation Olympic Games. This is the story of how two of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies, the CIA and Mossad, along with America's most secretive signals agency, the NSA, and Israel's elite cyber unit known as Unit 8200, came together in the shadows to build a weapon that changed everything, and this is the story of the moment they almost lost control of it entirely. To understand why this operation existed, you have to go back. You have to understand what Iran was building, how fast they were building it, and what the rest of the world was willing, or not willing, to do about it. By the early 2000s, Iran's nuclear program had become one of the most urgent and dangerous questions in global geopolitics. For decades, Iran had publicly insisted its nuclear ambitions were peaceful, that it was simply pursuing energy independence, civilian power, the right of any sovereign nation to develop its own resources. But the intelligence picture told a different story. Enriched uranium, the kind Iran was producing at Natanz, has two uses. At low enrichment levels, it can power a reactor. At high enrichment levels, the levels that take significantly more centrifuges, significantly more time, and significantly more secrecy, it can power a bomb. The centrifuge is the machine at the heart of this equation. It is, in its most basic form, a cylinder that spins at extraordinary speed. You feed uranium hexafluoride gas into it, and the centrifuge's rotation separates the lighter from the heavier isotopes. One pass through is not enough. You need thousands of passes. You need hundreds, eventually thousands of centrifuges arranged in what engineers call cascades, long rows of interconnected machines that pass the gas from one to the next, gradually increasing its concentration. Natanz was being built to house those cascades. Underground. In reinforced concrete halls buried beneath the Iranian desert, engineered to survive airstrikes. By the mid-2000s, Iran had already installed thousands of centrifuges at the facility and was racing to install thousands more. Intelligence estimates suggested that if Iran continued at its current pace, it could accumulate enough highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon within a few years. For the United States and Israel, this was unacceptable, not just strategically, existentially. Israel, in particular, viewed a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. Iranian leadership had made statements calling for Israel's elimination. A nuclear weapon in those hands was not an abstract policy problem. It was, from Israel's perspective, a potential second Holocaust waiting to be armed. So what were the options? The United States and its allies had tried diplomacy. They had pushed for sanctions. They had worked through international institutions, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations Security Council. Some of these measures had effect. None of them stopped the centrifuges. The diplomatic clock and the nuclear clock were not running at the same speed, and the nuclear clock was winning. Military strikes were on the table. Israel had done it before. In 1981, Israeli jets bombed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor before it became operational, setting that program back by years. In 2007, Israeli aircraft destroyed a suspected Syrian nuclear facility. The strike option was real, it was credible, and it was seriously considered. But Natanz was different. It was underground. It was hardened. Conventional airstrikes might damage it, but destroying it would require sustained bombardment with specialized munitions, and even then, the results were uncertain, and the consequences of a military strike extended far beyond the physical damage to the facility. A strike on Iran could trigger a regional war. It could inflame the entire Middle East. It could spike oil prices, destabilize governments, hand Iran a propaganda victory and a legitimate grievance that would unite its population behind its government for a generation. The cure, in other words, might be worse than the disease. That is the strategic trap that George W. Bush found himself in when he first sat down with his intelligence chiefs and asked them, "What else can we do?" The operation that would eventually become known as Olympic Games began in the final years of the Bush administration, somewhere in the mid-2000s. The precise origin date is debated, but what is confirmed is that the National Security Agency, the NSA, America's signals intelligence arm, began working on the foundational concept of a cyberweapon designed not just to spy on Iran's nuclear program, but to physically damage it. This was an extraordinary idea. At this point in history, cyberweapons were understood primarily as tools of espionage and disruption. Hackers could steal data. They could shut down websites. They could intercept communications. They could cause inconvenience. But no one had ever seriously deployed a cyberweapon designed to make a physical machine destroy itself. The concept existed in theory, in academic papers, in the dark corners of defense research. But it had never been done at scale, against a real target, under presidential authorization. The question that drove the early planning was deceptively simple. Could you write a piece of code that could reach into the control systems of Iran's centrifuges and make them tear themselves apart, while the operators watching the screens saw nothing unusual? The answer required two things simultaneously. First, you needed an extraordinarily precise understanding of the target, not just that Natanz used centrifuges. You needed to know the exact make and model of the centrifuges. You needed to know which programmable logic controllers, the small industrial computers that control machinery, speed, and function, were being used to run them. You needed to know the exact software configuration, the exact parameters at which the centrifuges operated normally, and the exact stress points at which they would fail. This was not the kind of information you could find on the internet. It had to be collected. Second, you needed to find a way to get your weapon inside a facility that was air-gapped, meaning it had no connection to the outside internet. Natanz's control systems were deliberately isolated from the global network. You could not simply send Stuxnet to an email address and wait for someone to click a link. The weapon had to physically travel to the target, and it had to do so without anyone knowing they were carrying it. These were problems that no intelligence agency had ever solved simultaneously at this level of complexity, with this level of consequence. But the NSA had been building toward this capability for years, and it had a partner. Israel's Unit 8200 is, in many respects, the Israeli equivalent of the NSA, an elite signals intelligence unit that has long been considered among the most technically sophisticated intelligence organizations on Earth. Its alumni have gone on to found some of the most successful cybersecurity companies in the world. Its culture is intensely meritocratic, deeply technical, and shaped by the very specific security pressures that Israel faces every day. When the NSA came to Unit 8200 with the problem of Natanz, they were not going to a second-rate partner. They were going to the one organization on the planet that might actually be able to help them solve it. The CIA and Mossad's role in this partnership was different but equally critical. While the NSA and Unit 8200 focused on building the weapon, the CIA and Mossad focused on the intelligence that would make the weapon possible. They needed to know everything about Natanz's interior, its layout, its systems, its machines. That intelligence had to be gathered the old-fashioned way, through human sources and clandestine collection. The overlap between the technical side and the human intelligence side of this operation is what made it unprecedented. This was not just a cyber operation, it was a fusion of every tradecraft discipline the Western intelligence world had ever developed. Before a single line of malicious code was ever written, the intelligence community needed to build what was essentially a perfect replica of Natanz's control systems. You cannot write a weapon that targets specific machines running specific software at specific operational parameters without first knowing exactly what those machines, software, and parameters are. Here is where the story takes one of its most remarkable turns. When Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi agreed to dismantle his country's nuclear weapons program in 2003, he handed over his centrifuge equipment to Western intelligence. Those centrifuges were the same model, the P-1 centrifuge, that Iran was using at Natanz. They were the same design, same specifications, same vulnerabilities. This was an extraordinary piece of luck, or perhaps more accurately, an extraordinary piece of strategic patience paying off. Suddenly, the United States had in its possession the exact hardware it needed to test a cyberweapon against. The weapon could be built and tested not just in a simulation, but against real physical centrifuges running real enrichment processes in a setting that replicated the actual conditions at Natanz as closely as possible. The testing operation was kept under some of the tightest security protocols of the entire program. If word got out that the United States was physically testing a cyberweapon's ability to destroy centrifuges, the entire operation would be compromised. The Iranians would know they were being targeted. They would harden their systems, change their configurations, and the weapon would become useless before it was ever deployed. Meanwhile, on the technical side, the programmers working on what they internally called the bug were solving problems that had never been solved before. The centrifuge control systems at Natanz used Siemens programmable logic controllers, industrial computers made by the German engineering giant Siemens. To attack those systems, the weapon needed to know exactly how to speak their language. It needed to understand their code, their commands, their communication protocols. And it needed to do something almost impossibly clever. The weapon needed to intercept the signals being sent from the controllers to the monitoring systems, the screens that the engineers watched, and replace those signals with recordings of normal operation. While the centrifuges were being pushed beyond their limits, the screens had to continue showing perfectly normal readings. The engineers had to see green lights and normal numbers, even as the machines were physically tearing themselves apart. Think about what this requires technically. You are not just attacking a system. You are simultaneously attacking the system and defending your attack from being detected by the people responsible for the system. You are running two operations inside one piece of code: the sabotage and the cover story for the sabotage. This is the level of sophistication that made security researchers, when they eventually analyzed Stuxnet publicly, describe it as something that appeared to come from a different era of technological development, as if it had been dropped into the present from the future. The weapon that emerged from this process was built in phases. David Sanger, the New York Times journalist whose reporting in 2012 first confirmed U.S. and Israeli involvement, described the operation in three broad stages: the beacon, the bug, and the strike. The beacon came first. Before you can destroy a system, you need to understand it completely. The early version of the code that was eventually introduced to Natanz's network acted primarily as a reconnaissance tool, mapping the facility's systems, counting the centrifuges, identifying the exact configuration of the control network, and reporting that information back to its creators. This was intelligence collection at its most intimate level, not from satellites or intercepted communications, but from inside the target system itself. What the beacon returned was a picture of extraordinary detail: the facility's exact layout in terms of network systems, the number of centrifuges in operation at any given time, the precise model numbers of the Siemens PLCs controlling them, the exact frequency at which the centrifuges operated normally. All of this information went back to the engineers building the weapon, allowing them to refine their code to a level of precision that was, in the words of multiple cybersecurity analysts who later examined it publicly, unlike anything the security research community had ever seen. The bug, the actual destructive payload, was built around a specific attack methodology. The IR-1 centrifuge at Natanz operated normally at approximately 1064 Hz. That is the rotational frequency at which it performed its function correctly and safely. The weapon was programmed to push that frequency to 1410 Hz, a significant overspeed that placed enormous stress on the aluminum tubes of the centrifuge. Then, after 15 minutes at that speed, the worm would return the centrifuge to its normal operating frequency, so the anomaly was brief enough not to trigger alarms. 27 days later, the second phase began. The worm slowed the centrifuges dramatically, dropping them to just a few hundred hertz for 50 minutes, a significant underspeed that created entirely different physical stresses on the machinery. The combination of these two stresses, the overspeed and the underspeed, applied repeatedly over months, caused the aluminum tubes to expand and contract in ways they were never designed to handle. The metal fatigued, components shifted. The centrifuges began making contact with parts they should never touch. They destroyed themselves from the inside out, slowly, invisibly, while the monitoring screens continued to show normal operation. What would you do as an engineer if your equipment was failing, but every readout said it was fine? You would probably doubt yourself first. You would check your procedures, review your maintenance logs, question whether the equipment was installed correctly, wonder if there was a design flaw in the machines. You would almost certainly not, as your first instinct, conclude that a foreign intelligence agency had placed an invisible weapon inside your control system. That psychological dimension, the confusion, the self-doubt, the wasted time chasing phantom explanations, was as much a part of the weapon's design as the technical payload itself. The delay between the sabotage and its discovery was built into the strategy. Here is the question that sits at the center of this entire operation. If Natanz had no connection to the outside internet, how did the weapon get in? The answer involves a combination of human intelligence and a piece of hardware so ordinary that it is almost comical: the USB drive. Natanz's air gap, its deliberate isolation from the global network, was its greatest security feature, but an air gap only protects a system from what travels through wires and wireless signals. It does nothing to protect against a human being who physically carries an infected device into the facility. The operation to bridge that air gap required identifying people who had legitimate, authorized access to Natanz's control systems and who could be used, knowingly or unknowingly, to carry the weapon inside. Reports confirmed that 5 Iranian contractors, companies that did work at the Natanz facility, had their systems compromised first. The weapon spread to these contractor networks, and from there, it traveled with the contractors into the facility itself. Engineers and technicians who worked at Natanz regularly connected their personal devices to work systems. A USB drive used on a contractor's laptop and then connected inside the facility was all it took. The precision required here was not just technical, it was operational. You needed intelligence about who worked at the facility, who worked for which contractors had access to which systems. You needed to target the right people without alerting them or alerting Iranian counterintelligence. This was CIA and Mossad tradecraft operating at the highest level, in direct support of a technical operation of unprecedented sophistication. And it worked. The weapon got inside Natanz. It found the Siemens controllers it was looking for. It confirmed the exact configuration it had been built to target. And it began its slow, patient, invisible work. The operation did not happen under a single president, a single administration, or a single strategic vision. It began under George W. Bush and continued with acceleration and escalation under Barack Obama. This transition from one president to the next across a political divide with the same covert program continuing uninterrupted says something important about how the United States treats certain categories of strategic priority. When Bush was briefed on the concept of a cyberweapon targeting Natanz, his concern was not whether to pursue it, but whether it would work. The military option, airstrikes, was never off the table, but it carried enormous costs. The cyber option, if it worked, could set back Iran's program without triggering a war. That calculus was compelling enough to authorize significant investment in the program's development. When Obama took office in January 2009, he inherited a program that was already in motion. According to reporting confirmed by multiple officials and detailed in Sanger's book, Obama was briefed on the operation early in his presidency and made the decision to not just continue it, but to accelerate it. The intelligence coming back from Natanz was promising. The weapon appeared to be working. Iran's centrifuge count was rising, but so was its failure rate, and the Iranians could not explain why. Obama's authorization of each subsequent escalation of the attack, each new phase, each more aggressive version of the code, required direct presidential sign-off. This is a critical detail because it speaks to how seriously the United States government treated the unprecedented nature of what it was doing. This was not a rogue operation run by intelligence cowboys without oversight. Every major step required the President of the United States to personally authorize it. There were debates inside the administration about the risks. What happens if the code spreads beyond Natanz? What if it infects systems in other countries? What if it is discovered and traced back to the United States? What if Iran retaliates, not militarily, but with its own cyber weapons against American infrastructure? These were not hypothetical questions. They were live debates happening in the Situation Room among some of the most senior national security officials in the world. The decision, repeatedly, was to proceed. The alternative, a nuclear-armed Iran or a military strike and its consequences, was judged to be worse. By 2009, the results were visible. Iran's centrifuge failures at Natanz had reached a level that was statistically impossible to explain by normal mechanical attrition. Iranian engineers and officials were publicly acknowledging that they were experiencing problems with their centrifuges. In international nuclear inspections, satellite imagery, and intelligence reporting, the picture was clear. Something was wrong at Natanz, and the Iranians could not figure out what. The weapon had destroyed approximately 1,000 centrifuges, about 1/5 of the total installed at Natanz at the time. But the destruction was not just physical, it was psychological. The Iranian nuclear program's leadership was operating under a cloud of uncertainty that may have been even more damaging than the physical losses. When machines fail and you do not know why, you cannot trust any of your machines. You cannot know which centrifuges are compromised and which are not. You cannot know whether your processes are producing reliable results. You cannot know whether the enrichment data you are collecting is accurate. The uncertainty was, in its own way, a second weapon delivered alongside the first. Iranian nuclear officials reportedly fired some of their own engineers, believing the failures were the result of incompetence or negligence. They replaced equipment, they brought in new technicians, they ran diagnostics that came back clean because the weapon was designed to evade exactly those diagnostics. They were chasing a ghost, and the ghost was winning. And then, in the summer of 2010, everything changed. Not because the operation was concluded, not because Iran discovered the weapon through its own investigation, but because the weapon escaped. At some point, the exact mechanism remains a matter of analysis rather than confirmed public record. A version of Stuxnet spread beyond the boundaries of its intended target. Instead of staying confined to the systems at Natanz and the contractor networks directly connected to it, the worm began spreading through the broader internet. It began appearing on computers in Iran, in India, in Indonesia, in Europe, and eventually around the world. By June 2010, a small cybersecurity firm in Belarus called Virus Blockada detected an unusual piece of malware on a client's computer in Iran. Sergey Ulisin, a security researcher at the company, noticed something about this malware that was immediately strange. It was not behaving like normal malware. It was not trying to steal data or extort money or recruit computers into a botnet. It appeared to be doing something much more specific and much more unusual. As Ulisin and his colleagues began analyzing the code, they started sharing what they found with the broader cybersecurity research community. Within weeks, some of the most talented security researchers in the world were digging into Stuxnet, and what they were finding was astonishing. The weapon used 4 separate zero-day exploits, previously unknown vulnerabilities in Windows operating systems that could be used to compromise a computer without the user doing anything wrong. Zero-day exploits are extraordinarily valuable in the cybersecurity world. A single zero-day exploit, unknown to the software vendor and therefore unpatched, can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the black market. Most sophisticated cyber attacks use 1, maybe 2. Stuxnet used 4 simultaneously. The weapon also used stolen digital certificates, legitimate security credentials stolen from real technology companies and used to make Stuxnet's components look like authorized, trustworthy software. This allowed the worm to bypass security checks that would normally flag unsigned or unfamiliar code as suspicious, and at the center of the weapon, in its deepest layer, the researchers found the payload targeting Siemens industrial controllers, the code designed specifically to manipulate centrifuge speeds while feeding false readings to monitoring systems. This was not general-purpose malware adapted for an industrial target. This was a weapon built from the ground up with extraordinary precision to attack one specific type of industrial system running one specific type of process. The cybersecurity community's conclusion was immediate and unanimous. This could only have been built by a nation-state or by multiple nation-states working together, with resources, intelligence access, and technical capability far beyond what any criminal or hacktivist group could marshal. The question was not whether a government built Stuxnet. The question was which government, or governments. As Stuxnet spread across the internet and security researchers continued pulling apart its code, the story began moving from the cybersecurity world into the mainstream press. By late 2010, journalists, analysts, and governments were all asking the same questions. Who built this? Why? And what did it mean? Iran's response was a study in controlled outrage. Iranian officials publicly acknowledged that Natanz had been targeted by malicious software. They insisted the attack had failed, or had been neutralized, or had caused only minor damage. These claims were contradicted by the satellite imagery and inspection data coming out of the facility, which showed a clear and significant drop in operational centrifuges during the period when Stuxnet was active. Neither the United States nor Israel publicly acknowledged any role in the operation. Both governments declined to comment on intelligence matters. This is standard practice, and it held, at least officially, for nearly 2 years. But Washington leaks. It always has, and it always will. By 2012, David Sanger of the New York Times had pieced together enough of the story, through interviews with officials who had been directly involved or who had been in the room during key decisions, to publish a detailed account of Operation Olympic Games and America's role in creating Stuxnet. His book, Confront and Conceal, went further, providing a detailed account of the operation's origins, development, and execution. The publication of that book triggered a federal leak investigation. General James Cartwright, the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, eventually pleaded guilty to making false statements to federal investigators in connection with his alleged disclosure of classified information to Sanger. Cartwright was one of the most senior military officials in the United States, the number 2 officer in the entire American military chain of command, and his involvement in leaking information about Stuxnet illustrated how high the operation had reached inside the U.S. government. Here is where the story becomes something more than a tale of technical brilliance and covert success. Here is where the costs begin to arrive. The spread of Stuxnet beyond Natanz was not just an operational embarrassment. It was, in a deeper sense, a strategic miscalculation with consequences that are still unfolding today. The moment Stuxnet became public, the moment its code was available for researchers and governments and intelligence services around the world to analyze and reverse engineer, something irreversible happened. The proof of concept existed. The barrier had been broken. The line between digital and physical destruction had been crossed, publicly, demonstrably, and permanently. Every nation-state with a cyber program looked at Stuxnet and learned from it. They learned what was possible. They learned what it looked like to write a weapon sophisticated enough to cross from the digital world into the physical one. They drew their own conclusions about how such a weapon could be built, adapted, and aimed. Iran, in particular, drew a very specific conclusion. It needed to build its own offensive cyber capability. Within 2 years of Stuxnet's discovery, Iranian-linked hackers had conducted one of the most destructive cyber attacks in corporate history. In the summer of 2012, a piece of malware called Shamoon struck Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabian national oil company, one of the most valuable companies in the world. Shamoon wiped the hard drives of approximately 30,000 computers in a matter of hours, replacing their data with an image of a burning American flag. It did not destroy physical infrastructure the way Stuxnet did, but the damage was staggering. It took Saudi Aramco weeks to recover. The cyber arms race that experts had been predicting for years had arrived, and its starting gun was Stuxnet. If you were designing a policy to deter Iran from developing nuclear weapons without triggering a conventional war, you might judge Stuxnet a partial success. The centrifuges were damaged. The program was delayed, by estimates ranging from a few months to a couple of years, depending on which analysis you trust. A military strike was avoided, at least in that moment. But if you were designing a policy to prevent the world from becoming a more dangerous place, to avoid opening a Pandora's box of state-sponsored cyberweapons targeting critical infrastructure, Stuxnet represents a different kind of ledger entirely. One dimension of this story that rarely receives the attention it deserves is the human cost that existed alongside the technical brilliance. Intelligence operations of this complexity do not exist in a sterile world of computers and code. They exist in a world of people. People who are recruited, manipulated, used, and sometimes destroyed. The contractors whose systems were compromised to carry Stuxnet into Natanz were, in most accounts, unwitting participants. They did not know they were carrying a weapon. They had no idea that the ordinary act of connecting a device to a work computer had made them a delivery mechanism for the most sophisticated cyberweapon in history. Some of them continued working at Natanz, unaware of what had passed through their hands. The Iranian engineers who watched their centrifuges fail and could not explain why faced a different kind of human cost. Some were likely blamed for failures that were not their fault. Some may have had their careers destroyed. The paranoia that Stuxnet deliberately induced in the Iranian program, the suspicion that perhaps the failures were caused by saboteurs, by infiltrators, by people inside the program itself, would have poisoned the working environment at Natanz in ways that extended far beyond the physical damage to the machines. Intelligence is never clean. Covert operations never leave behind only the damage they were designed to cause. They leave behind disrupted lives, wrongful accusations, and human collateral that never appears in the official assessments of success or failure. If you think about the engineers sitting at those monitors in Natanz, watching their machines fail while the screens told them everything was fine. It is hard not to feel the profound strangeness of their position. They were, in a very real sense, the victims of a weapon they could not see, could not understand, and could not defend against. Whatever you think of Iran's nuclear program, whatever policy position you hold, that human reality is worth sitting with for a moment. Iran's response to Stuxnet was not passive, and it was not confined to the Shamoon attack on Saudi Aramco. The Iranian government made a strategic decision after 2010 to invest heavily in building its own offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Iran's most powerful military force, expanded its cyber operations significantly in the years following Stuxnet's discovery. Iranian hackers, operating under various covers, targeted American financial institutions, disrupted banking websites, probed infrastructure systems, and conducted espionage operations against American defense contractors and government networks. The sophistication of these operations grew steadily over time. Iran had learned from having a nation-state weapon dissected in public exactly what sophisticated state-sponsored cyber attacks looked like. The lesson they took from Stuxnet was not that they were vulnerable. The lesson they took was that cyber weapons work, that they can cause physical damage, and that they needed to be in the game. In the years since Stuxnet was first publicly identified, its shadow has fallen over virtually every significant development in the world of cyber warfare and critical infrastructure security. Every attack on a power grid, every intrusion into an industrial control system, every sophisticated piece of state-sponsored malware discovered by security researchers, all of it is understood to some degree in relation to Stuxnet. It is the original text of the new language of digital warfare. The weapon demonstrated several things that had previously been theoretical. It demonstrated that an air-gapped network, a system deliberately isolated from the internet, could be penetrated by combining technical sophistication with human intelligence operations. It demonstrated that industrial control systems, the systems that run power plants and water treatment facilities and manufacturing processes, were vulnerable to cyber attack in ways that their designers had never anticipated or designed against, and it demonstrated that digital weapons could cause real, physical, irreversible damage in the material world. For the global critical infrastructure community, Stuxnet was an alarm bell that could not be unrung. Power utilities, water treatment facilities, transportation systems, oil refineries, all of them suddenly had to confront the possibility that their control systems, many of which had been designed decades earlier with no thought of cybersecurity, were potential targets for the kind of attack that had just been demonstrated against Iran. The security investments, policy changes, and architectural overhauls that followed cost billions of dollars across dozens of industries and multiple countries. And yet, even now, with everything that is publicly known about Operation Olympic Games, the confirmed U.S. and Israeli involvement, the presidential authorizations, the technical details laid out in thousands of pages of security research, there are questions that remain genuinely open. Did it work? In the narrow tactical sense, did it destroy centrifuges? Did it delay Iran's nuclear program? The answer is almost certainly yes. Approximately 1,000 centrifuges were destroyed. The program was disrupted. But Iran did not stop enriching uranium. The program continued. It slowed, but it did not stop. The fundamental strategic goal, preventing Iran from eventually acquiring the capability to build a nuclear weapon if it chose to, was not achieved by Stuxnet alone. The operation bought time. Whether that time was used effectively is a different question. Did opening the door to state-sponsored cyber weapons against critical infrastructure make the world more or less safe? This is the question that haunts every serious analysis of Stuxnet's legacy. The United States and Israel made a calculated decision that the immediate threat posed by Iran's nuclear program was severe enough to justify crossing a line that had never been crossed. They built a weapon that worked, and in doing so, They established a precedent that every adversary, every rival, every state that feels threatened by American or Western power has since taken note of. Before Stuxnet, the idea of attacking a power grid or an industrial facility through a cyberweapon was theoretical. After Stuxnet, it was documented, demonstrated, and achievable. That is a change in the global security environment that cannot be undone. One of the most striking features of the entire Stuxnet story is how thoroughly the people who built and authorized it have avoided claiming credit. Neither the United States government nor the Israeli government has ever officially acknowledged creating Stuxnet. Senior officials have, on various occasions and in various formulations, declined to comment, neither confirmed nor denied, or simply walked past the question. The reasons for this silence are not hard to understand. Official acknowledgement would require official explanation. It would invite legal challenges about whether the operation violated international law. It would demand answers about the decision to deploy a weapon that ultimately escaped its target and spread across the internet, potentially causing collateral damage to systems that had nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program. And it would set a precedent for how nations discuss and account for offensive cyber operations, a precedent that no government currently wants to set. But the silence also serves a purpose beyond legal and diplomatic caution. The ambiguity is itself a tool of deterrence. If a potential adversary cannot be fully certain of what the United States and its allies are capable of, what weapons they have built, what systems they have already penetrated, what capabilities they are holding in reserve, that uncertainty has its own deterrent value. The shadow of Stuxnet, even without official acknowledgement, sends a message to every government developing weapons of mass destruction. You may already be targeted by something you cannot see. General Cartwright, whose guilty plea in the leak investigation gave the public one of its clearest official confirmations of American involvement, was later pardoned by President Obama. The details of his role, the full extent of what he disclosed to Sanger, and the complete story of the internal debates and decisions that shaped Operation Olympic Games remain in their fullest form classified. We are now living in the world that Stuxnet made, the cyber weapons that various state actors have deployed since 2010, against infrastructure, against financial systems, against democratic processes, all operate in a space that Stuxnet helped define. The tools have evolved, the targets have expanded, the actors have multiplied, but the fundamental concept, that code can be a weapon capable of physical destruction, that digital and physical security are inseparable, was demonstrated to the world by the operation that took place beneath the Iranian desert between roughly 2006 and 2010. If you are reading this on a device connected to the internet, and you are, then you live inside the infrastructure that makes this kind of warfare possible. The power that runs your home, the water that comes from your tap, the financial systems that hold your money, the transportation networks that move your goods, all of these systems are, to varying degrees, controlled by industrial computers that are in some way connected to digital networks. They are all, in the post-Stuxnet world, potential targets. This is not cause for paralysis. The security community has worked intensively in the years since Stuxnet to harden these systems, to understand their vulnerabilities, to build defenses. But the awareness of the threat, the serious, sober, institutional awareness that these systems need protection, came, in large part, from a weapon that was designed not to protect anything, but to destroy something. The engineers who built Stuxnet were not thinking about critical infrastructure security as a global policy problem. They were thinking about one facility, one program, one threat. But the world does not stay inside the boundaries of what anyone intends for it. If you have followed this story to this point, you have been watching a decision-making process that was, by every measure, extraordinarily careful and considered. Presidential authorizations at every step. Ongoing debates about risks and consequences, deliberate choices to pursue a covert option over a military one, in part to avoid the massive human costs of conventional war. By the standards of covert operations, Operation Olympic Games was a model of oversight, careful planning, and measured escalation. And it still produced consequences that its architects did not intend and could not fully control. The weapon escaped. The precedent was set. The arms race began. Iranian cyber capabilities grew. Other nations took note and began developing their own capabilities. This is the central moral truth of Stuxnet, and it is a truth worth sitting with seriously. Intelligence operations, even the most carefully authorized and precisely executed ones, do not stay inside the boxes drawn for them. They change the environment in which they operate. They create new realities that then require new responses. And the people who made those careful, considered decisions at the start do not always get to manage the full consequences of what they set in motion. The question of whether the decision to build and deploy Stuxnet was the right one is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is simple, in either direction, is not thinking carefully enough about it. There were real stakes, a real threat, a real effort to find a path that avoided the costs of conventional war, and there were real consequences, intended and unintended, that are still unfolding. Before we reach the final chapter of this story, if you have made it this far, through the code and the centrifuges, through the presidential briefings and the Situation Room debates, through the engineers watching their screens while their machines destroyed themselves, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. If you believe that understanding how power actually operates in the world is worth your time, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us in the comments, if you had been the president sitting in that room, faced with the choice between a military strike and an invisible cyber weapon with unknown consequences, what would you have decided? The answer is harder than it looks. The story of Stuxnet does not have a clean conclusion, and that is perhaps the most important thing about it. There was no peace treaty, no press conference, no official moment of resolution. The operation ended not with a decision, but with an exposure, a piece of malware detected by a researcher in Belarus, analyzed by a global community of security professionals, and eventually traced back to the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth. Iran did not stop its nuclear program. It continued, and in the years after Stuxnet, Iran actually expanded its uranium enrichment capacity significantly. The nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, negotiated in 2015, was the diplomatic mechanism that achieved what Stuxnet could not, a verifiable reduction in Iran's enrichment activities in exchange for sanctions relief. That deal was subsequently abandoned by the United States in 2018, and the nuclear standoff between Iran and the West continues in a new form today. The centrifuges at Natanz were repaired and replaced. New ones were installed. Iran went on to develop more advanced centrifuge models that could enrich uranium faster and more efficiently than the IR-1 machines that Stuxnet targeted. The program was delayed. It was not stopped. But something else happened that cannot be measured in centrifuges or enrichment percentages. The operation proved something about what intelligence and technology could accomplish together. What was possible when the most sophisticated signals intelligence agency in the world worked alongside the most technically advanced military cyber unit, backed by presidential authority, and sustained over years of patient, precise, invisible work. It proved that a weapon could be built that crossed from the digital into the physical, that could destroy machines without touching them, that could feed lies to the people trying to detect it, and that could operate inside one of the most secure facilities on Earth without ever announcing its presence. That proof exists. It cannot be unknown, and it has been studied, absorbed, and built upon by every government, every military, every intelligence service that takes the future of warfare seriously. Which is to say, all of them. The world that existed before June 2010, when a researcher in Belarus first looked at a strange piece of code on a client's computer and felt that something was profoundly different about it, no longer exists. A line was crossed beneath the Iranian desert. The first cyberweapon that could destroy physical infrastructure was built, deployed, and used. And the era of digital warfare, real, physical, consequential digital warfare, had begun. The centrifuges are silent now, But what they started spinning into motion will not stop for a very long time.